and Emina Bužinkić, who in very different but equally beautiful poetics spoke about restless histories, East Europe as allegedly raceless region and its consequences. We try to imagine anti-colonial museum as a practice and immersed ourselves in a landscape of doing feminist research with refugees. So today in our first session, you will hear from 4 amazing speakers that I will now introduce to you in order of appearance. So first, I want to introduce to you Manuela Boatcă. So this is the person that whose work I have been following for many years now, and I have learned a lot from her, but we never met before. This is our first encounter, and I'm very excited to welcome Manuela. Manuela is a professor of sociology and head of School of the Global Studies program at the University of Freiburg, Germany. She has published widely on world system analysis, decolonial perspectives on global inequalities, gender and citizenship in modernity, coloniality, and geopolitics of knowledge in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. In 2018, she was awarded an ACLS collaborative fellowship alongside literature scholar Anca Prvulescu from Washington University in St. Louis, for a comparative project on inter-imperiality in Transylvania. Welcome, Manuela. Our second speaker is Bojana Videkanić. Bojana recently published a very important book on non-alignment and art, and that we were all very excited about, and I'm so happy to be able to welcome Bojana in this discussion about decoloniality in Eastern Europe. Bojana is an art historian and artist, originally from Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. She now lives in Canada, where she teaches at the University of Waterloo. Her focus is on Yugoslav art of the 20th century in the context of local and international modernism. Her book on non-alignment, socialism, and Yugoslav modernism was published in 2020 for McGill Queen's University Press. Now, Ovidiu, whom I've known for a very long time. Now our paths crossed on many occasions. The last time, if I remember well, it was in Belgrade, on this event, dialoguing between the posts. We had a very nice time together. So welcome, Ovidiu. Ovidiu is a philosopher, cultural theorist and translator, editor of the journal Idea, Arts Plus Society, and collections coordinator at Idea Publishing House. He's a visiting fellow at the Max Planck University for Social Anthropology. He's working on decolonial thought, critical social theory, East Europe, and the cultural history of socialism and post-socialism. And finally, Čarna Brković, with whom I have many times been on the same side, let's say, in the recent political conflicts on the local scene. We also met a couple of times. The last time, if I remember well, it was on the conference in Belgrade that was dealing with the migrations. You have to remind me what was that about, but you can do that later. So Čarna is a lecturer in cultural anthropology and European ethnology at the University of Göttingen in Germany. She holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Manchester. Her studies of refugee camps, LGBT activism, and grassroots humanitarianism combines the focus on inequalities and power with a focus on social complexity and ambiguity. She now works on a book that explores how Red Cross humanitarianism in Montenegro pursued world-making differently within the non-aligned movement and 40 years later during Europeanization process. So welcome, Čarna. I would like to kindly ask now our speakers to introduce their notions, and after that we will have a Q&A session. I encourage the audience to use the chat function for comments and questions that I will later present to our speakers. So Manuela, the floor is yours, and welcome everyone once more.
Thank you very much, Anna, for having me and for the kind introduction. It's a really inspiring conversation to have with all of you, so I'm really excited to be engaging in this dialogue with you. I'm going to share the amazing slide that we were all provided with in terms of our own notions. And mine is the notion of unequal Europes, which I think in the context of the lexicon of decoloniality in Eastern Europe is a good place to start, namely questioning the very category of Eastern Europe. So a lexicon of decoloniality where? How far east is Eastern Europe, and especially east of what? Because I think yesterday, Živka mentioned the importance of geography and of mapping. And we've known for a long time from critical geographers that really on a rotating globe, east and west are just directional indicators. So unless there is an agreed upon point of reference, we don't know exactly what east and west refer to. So when we're talking about Eastern Europe, what is the implicit point of reference? So really engaging decolonially with the easternness of Eastern Europe, what are we talking about? And in trying to grapple with my own positionality and trying to understand the same question, I found it very helpful to engage with the notion of Martinican writer Edouard Glissant when he said the West is a project. So the West for him is not in the West, it is a project, not a place. And I want to suggest that this very much goes for Europe as a whole, but not only for Europe generally, but for Eastern Europe in particular, meaning that Eastern Europe itself is a project. As a project, it's something that has been a work in progress for a very long time. It's still a work in progress, so we're witnessing its progress, but we're also witnessing its problematic results. So the mere engagement, the very question that moves us, for me, in engaging with decoloniality in Eastern Europe has to do with the fact that how come it became a problem? How come it is different? It is the other, it is the lesser Europe. And so I was basically trying to find a way around these questions and find my place in this shifting process as a Romanian migrant in Germany, coming to Germany 25 years ago. That was very much a time when the idea of what it means to be in Europe and of Europe was newly negotiated. Not that it wasn't negotiated before, it's constantly negotiated, but it was a different understanding, namely very much tying the notion of Europe to the notion of the European Union and to the institution of the European Union, such that I had been raised to consider myself European. And growing up in a white middle-class family in Bucharest, I grew up with the privilege of not having to question whether or not I was white. But coming to Germany 25 years ago, in the process where the Eastern enlargement of the European Union was being discussed, all of a sudden, it wasn't very clear that I was European. And all of a sudden, or actually rather gradually, the idea that whiteness and Europeanness are synonymous, but that if you're not exactly European, you're not exactly white, was starting to seep into not only social reality and everyday experiences, but also policy. So I'm very grateful that we're here in a context where we discuss visual representation and artistic representation, because looking around for material to kind of take hold of these shifting meanings, I was very thankful for some of the material of the European Commission, of all things. And those of you who know my work know that I've used this map a lot, but it's still out there. You can find it on the website of the European Commission. And this was the map that was circulating in the before the so-called Eastern enlargement of the European Union, representing the member states at the time in yellow, so the older member states, and representing the 10 Eastern European countries that were supposed to join in 2004 in blue, as well as representing those who have been denied membership in the 2004 accession, namely Romania and Bulgaria at the time, in purple, and also Turkey in purple, although Turkey had been a candidate to accession since 1986. Now, the European Commission, being a very diligent institution, immediately updated the map upon the enlargement, so that the next map, a couple of months later, represented the entire EU 25, including the 10 Eastern European members, all in yellow. Romania and Bulgaria were now represented in dark gray, as was Croatia, that had taken up negotiations membership. Now, the shades of gray, pardon the pun, were kind of shifting now, because Turkey was a lighter gray, and the rest, it looked like the one thing you don't want to be is some kind of gray, but the darker the better. But actually you want to be yellow. And so I was working a lot with these maps in order to see how the kind of content that was being produced by the European Union discourse, the idea that what we have with the enlargement of the European Union is this unity in diversity, but the unity is what counts, is a reproduction of an understanding of a coherent Europe. And coherent Europe being synonymous at the same time with the European Union was still producing shifts in meaning. And some of these shifts in meaning were addressed by people that were looking at different shades of Europeanness or degrees of Europeanness from a Southern European perspective, such as Roberto Dinotto in his book, Europe in Theory, that basically on the cover already foregrounds the importance of both Christianity and whiteness, with this kind of crucified, very white Christ being looked upon by a bunch of elderly, we can tell, and knowing the book, we also know Italian women who are commenting upon the centrality of the Christ figure. So the idea that Christianity, whiteness, and Europe are becoming more and more coterminous also in the understanding of the European Union is also something that for my discipline of sociology, or for social theory more generally, I think can be said as making coherent Europe part of the legacy of social theory, which has long operated with a sublimated, or we could call it sanitized, version of European history, and European history writ large, in which European is European, but it doesn't include the experience and the history of the East of Europe, and it doesn't include the experience and the history of the South of Europe too much, which is the perspective from which Dinotto is speaking. He wants to rethink Europe from the so-called, derogatorily called, pigs countries, right? So the opposite of the BRICS, the opposite of the solid, developed developing countries, but the ones that are constantly in debt and constantly kind of destabilizing the European Union unity and diversity. So at the same time, the European history concept being upheld with this sanitized version was one in which the experience and the legacy of colonialism was missing, but also the experience and the legacy of imperialism was missing. So yeah, sure, you then get a coherent notion, but then that means you don't account for a very whole lot of both the history and the present. This is kind of a long detour to tell you how I came to the wish to classify, which in a decolonial perspective is not the best thing to go about, but to classify these degrees of Europeanness that were shaping the discourse in order to see where is it that we're being positioned when we're from the East of Europe, from the South of Europe, from the in-between, and from those forgotten and sublimated histories and experiences. And so starting from the criticism that Europe as a coherent notion does not very much include the legacy and the experience of the South, I started with the notion of decadent Europe, basically those that had lost both hegemony economically and subsequently the epistemic power to define what is the hegemonic European notion and to degrade its subaltern others when the shift in hegemony from the Iberian colonization to the French, Dutch, and then later British colonization happened around the 18th century. right? So what I'm talking about is a discourse in which the idea that, yes, Spain and Portugal, or the Iberian colonizers more generally, were important for the history of modernity. They started out colonization. If you go to Portugal today, you'd still hear the discoverers. It was us. It was without our knowledge, we never would have actually conquered the oceans. That was very much still there, but they're seen as participants in the history of modernity that had declined from that hegemony, from that importance, from that role, and now had and still have, we can argue, a semi-peripheral position in terms of economics. The one that ascended to power around the same time was the self-proclaimed, and I'm not saying this is my perspective, but the way the discourse was shaped, heroic Europe, the one that had produced the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the one that had actually made modernity, not just participated in it, but had produced it and had thus achieved, and according to the discourse, very much according to merit, achieved a core position in the world system. Coming to us, the us that we're talking about, in respect to that heroic Europe, but also in respect to the decadent Europe, the south and the east of Europe, or the southeast of Europe, were very much seen as epigonal, the ones constantly catching up, constantly trying to kind of do away with the lag, but never quite achieving that. And as such, only reproducing the achievements of the Enlightenment, the achievements of the Industrial Revolution, trying very hard, but really never getting there. Although economically, at least 19th, beginning of the 20th century, we can also talk about a semi-peripheral position there. And so in order not to stay just within a history of modernity and the role of each of these unequal Europes in the history of modernity, I was also looking at their role in producing coloniality. And here, very much, of course, we know Iberian colonization was the founding moment of coloniality. Heroic Europe was very central for consolidating coloniality, but it's not that the epigonal Europe, the Balkans, Southeastern Europe, were left out or were in the same position as the colonized, but very much in many ways economically, epistemically, and culturally complicit with the colonial project. So in this sense, I was very interested and thought, from that position, I can shed a different light upon the kind of differentiations within the discourse of Europe and Europeanness. And that's kind of enough in order to have a critical perspective. And then I realized that staying within the idea of the complicity of epigonal Europe, that I was myself forgetting a very central, at least visually, a very central occurrence, which is the fact that on these same maps, on both maps, the still existing colonies of Europe in South America and the Caribbean are also represented in yellow. Their Europeanness was never questioned. The fact that French Guyana and even Atlantic colonies such as the Canary Islands and the Azores have never had a discourse kind of directed at them that says, well, you're not really European, so you're actually geographically at least out of Europe, so not part of this either legacy or this history. And as we well know, we have a very different history when we look at Turkey, who constantly heard, well, Turkey's semi-Asian, so we don't really need to talk about Turkey joining Europe. Now, French Guyana is really not in Europe if we're just talking about a European continental perspective. So what does that have to do? So then I corrected my own understanding of the unequal Europes in order to include the category of forgotten Europes, not just because I was forgetting them, because I had obviously been looking at these maps and not seeing the very obvious that was there, that has to be in official maps because otherwise the maps are not complete. But I spoke about forgotten Europes because EU officials very much know that these territories are European territories. They are governed by EU law. Their citizens have European Union nationalities, depending on the status of each of the territories. So if they are forgotten, it's because they are never part of the discourse of what it means to be European, or what the definition of Europeanness, European values, European kind of belonging is. And of course, it's never a question of European whiteness, because if these territories were taken into account, the idea that whiteness and Europeanness are synonymous would never work. It would implode. Okay, so here, not only discussing the attitude towards the loss of definition power or maintaining definition power of the different Europes was important to me, hegemony in heroic Europe, the aspiration of also being European, maybe more European than others in the case of epigonal Europe, but a kind of nostalgia in the case of decadent Europes. And in the case of the forgotten Europes, a kind of ambivalence. Is it really the case that independence and sovereignty would leave us better off than we are right now? Or is a form of clinging to European law mean that we can claim some form of European responsibility for our past, which is a different story altogether. So I'm not going to get into that, but just to include here the role of each of these categories in coloniality, the fact that there is a forgotten Europe still very much part of the European Union colonial present, not the European Union colonial past, is instrumental in maintaining coloniality. We're not just talking about coloniality here. This is still classical colonialism, and this makes Europe also what it is today. So I know I'm basically out of time, I think. Just to bring this back to the question of, okay, so now we have a table and a classification, great. What does that do? What does that kind of contribute to destabilizing this notion of coherent Europe? And here again, I think learning from the Caribbean through the notion of creolization is a way of destabilizing, of at least questioning this notion of coherent Europe. So I've tried to make clear that Europe's geographical, religious, cultural, racial coherence has been a construct historically and geopolitically, so we don't need to take it at face value. There was never any coherent Europe. The European Union discourse, at least until Brexit, has tried to kind of solidify this understanding and also to monopolize the term Europe. But we can contribute to a creolization of the notion of Europe by taking into account relations of power with the areas colonized and occupied by European states, not only in the past, but also today. And thinking Europe from its others means not only thinking critically through the Eastern periphery or the Eastern semi-periphery or the Southern semi-periphery, but also thinking and learning with and from those colonized today in order to understand what that does to a notion of Europeanness. That also means that all of these experiences that were never there, discussing what it means to be European if you're not white, what it means to be European if you practice an African religion in the Caribbean, is part of the history of Europe. And all of these experiences of having been racialized as non-European, non-Western, and non-white is a way of creolizing Europe that brings us back to a notion of coloniality. And I'm closing with this. Thinking through invisibilized or peripheral formations is a way of thinking from coloniality, as everyone probably present here knows very well. I find it helpful the way this has been brought together with the notion of creolization by Françoise Lyonnais and Xu Meishu, when they said, if minor formations, such as the still colonized, very tiny territorial formations somewhere around the world's oceans, become the focus of attention, if minor formations become method and theory, then new analytics will be brought to the foreground to creolize the universalisms we live with today, doing so from the bottom up and from the inside out. It is this process of becoming theory of the minor that we're also calling creolization. I'll leave it at that and hope for a rich discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela, so much for this very necessary input, and you put it so well. So I'm very much looking forward to discussion. I have a lot of questions myself. Bojana, the floor is yours now. Please introduce us. What have you been working on in the last couple of years related to arts and non-alignment?
Okay. Thank you so much, Ana. Thank you for inviting me to participate in these important discussions. I'm going to start by a kind of a longer preamble to my discussion of the non-aligned, but in order to do that, I'll go through some slides as well. I hope you can see them okay. I'm sorry, like I lost my presentation at the beginning and now I found it actually, so I do have some images to show. So the preamble really deals with some of the things that we've been all talking about, and I've been thinking about in my own research within art, but largely within cultural history and socialism. And I'm going to present some of the ideas that kind of guide my thinking about non-alignment and Yugoslavia's art in socialism. So in 1997, Benita Perry wrote a short text reflecting on the field of post-colonial studies, which she helped build. She started the text with these words of caution, quote, "No discussion of the post-colonial should proceed without participants making known their understanding of the term. No word is more seductive in appearing to offer limitless possibilities for composing a revised narrative of colonialism and its consequences, and few words have proved more elusive," end quote. She goes on to provide a detailed critique of some forms of post-colonial theoretical discourse which allied materialist and historical analysis, grappling more with ideas of representation and superstructure, i.e., what she calls representational systems of colonialism, than with both larger material contexts of colonial imperial age and some complex oppositional or diverse voices among the people who have contributed to the projects of liberation in the 20th century. In Perry's analysis, it is not enough to simply read the empire's knowledge production as the be-all and end-all of its power, but to understand the underlying political economy, international social relationships, and I would also say military power structures in our grappling with imperialism. Likewise, Neil Lazarus offers a perceptive history of post-colonial theory itself, historiography of post-colonial theory itself, placing it squarely within larger geopolitical shifts of the late 20th century, emphasizing ascendancy of American liberalism, the dismembering of the welfare state in the West, with the concomitant process of rising political tensions between capital and labor, tensions that were temporarily pacified by the immediate post-war socialist alternative and economic boom. Political, economic, and cultural supremacy of the United States was therefore fully in swing, only to grow more as the 1980s approached. Lazarus places post-colonial, more broadly postmodern theoretical turn in Western academia, use included, of course, within these larger processes of the rise of the neoliberal order as socialism was weakening, tracing its intellectual outlines as it was developing post-1968, and evacuation of Marxist critiques of socialist antagonisms and capitalist contradictions, or what Perry would argue, political economy in a related material context of the empire. At the same time, the influence of Socialist International as it was developing in the post-war world was waning under the stress of the 1970s and 80s economic crisis. After 1989, as Živka so eloquently pointed out yesterday, the evacuation of Marxism was complete, and ascendancy of the neoliberal order fully in power. The neoliberal order, as Neil Lazarus points out, spent an enormous amount of money to suppress and stall liberational movements across the world and sponsored reactionary anti-communist groups and movements in virtually all countries of the third world and the second world, I would argue. A more recent analysis of some of these ideas can be also found in Neda Atanasovsky's excellent formulation of humanitarian empire and her analysis of post-1989 international interventions. Why am I mentioning this at the beginning? I'm doing it because it is crucial that we employ analyses based on post-colonial or any other theory, while also understanding the complex and also divergent dialogues and debates within the field itself, and the way that Eastern Europe and the Balkans can fit within those dialogues. In her intervention into the employment of post-coloniality and the discourse of race and racism in Yugoslavia, Tanja Petrović provides an analysis of the ways in which these cannot be easily transplanted to the region, especially not when it comes to the socialist period, as material circumstances of these histories, when analyzed in their complex socialist and Marxist trajectories, resist certain dematerialized readings. More importantly, socialist period was in both its material basis and its ideological structure markedly different system than that of capitalism. This cannot be denied. Her argument on these questions echoes those of Lazarman, Tim Brennan, Benita Perry, Robert Pascal, Vijay Prasad, Teresa Ebert, to name just a few, who continually call us back to consider material circumstances of the postcolonial discourse itself in order to recognize the ways in which socialism produced a very different kind of society. Socialism's revolutionary potential cannot be denied nor idealized, but historically situated. Petrović reminds that, quote, with its radical modernization, self-management, and non-aligned international politics, socialist Yugoslavia embodied international solidarity and political economic alternatives. Of course, she says, Yugoslav activities in the international arena should not be idealized. They did, nonetheless, open a space for alternatives and alliances outside of dominant order that were to a larger extent a continuation of colonial power relations, end quote. Petrovic's reminder of the potential embedded in the Yugoslav socialist project echoes that the reading of the anti-colonial liberation project that Lazarus also talks about. And he says, quote, it is important to recollect the energy, dynamism, and optimism of the decolonizing and immediate post-independence era, both for the sake of historical record, but also to enable us to register the success of this period, however slender, partial, provisional, or unsustainable they prove to be in the longer term, end quote. Similar debate is led among Anglophone US, especially historians on issues of race and racism, as people like Adolf Reed, Touré Reed, Robert Pascal, Barbara Field, Cedric Johnson, and others call our attention to material basis of racial relations. Reed reminds us of this when he says, quote, a Marxist perspective can be most helpful for understanding race and racism insofar as it perceives capitalism dialectically as a social totality that includes modes of production, relations of production, and pragmatically evolving ensemble of institutions and ideologies that lubricate and propel its reproduction, end quote. He goes on to say that in the case of racism in US, Marxism serves an enormously important purpose of demystifying, placing race and racism, first of all, as intrinsically linked, and secondly, in a historical context, as historically determined ideologies that, as he says, emerged and evolved as a constitutive element within a definite set of social relations anchored to a particular system of production. That system, of course, being capitalism of the colonial kind as it was developing in the US. So for Reed, as for Fields and Johnson, we cannot extricate racism from the violence of the particular system of production, which is capitalism, and the ways in which racism is used as a tool of capitalism. Reed offers the following. He says, regarding race, in particular, classificatory schemes have varied substantially, as have the narratives elaborating them. That is, which populations count as races, the criteria determining them, and the stakes attached to counting as one or as another in a given time have been much more fluid matters. Race, like all ideologies of a scripted hierarchy, is fundamentally pragmatic, end quote. So in order for us to understand both imperialism and racism in the East European context, we need to understand it in its contextualized historical role in the Balkans. So that racism in US is different than that in South Africa, for example, and who is considered black or white or in between shifts when we move, for example, from post-colonial Mozambique to Portugal. In fact, a friend of mine is considered to be white in Mozambique and black in Portugal. So race and racism for Reed and others are embedded in capitalism's and empire's particular mechanism of command and control, which are distributed differently and unevenly across the planet and the world systems, to use that terminology, depending on capitalism's different needs. Without losing sight of racism, and imperialism, it is crucial to also read classism in the history of Yugoslavia and the Balkan region. Both anti-imperialism of the 20th century that we find in the work of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia and socialism in the interwar period, and after that, is one in which class offers a very important insight into how and why the region finds itself in the imperial, neo-imperial predicament that it is in right now. In his prescient and eloquent analysis of the post-1989 situation in Serbia and the Balkans more broadly, Videkanić shows how the dominant liberal post-Yugoslav theoretical discourses, in this case critical Balkanology to be more precise, are deeply classist, gender, and racist. In Videkanić's close reading of some of the most famous representatives of critical Balkanology, Tomislav Loginović in particular, he reveals a deep-seated resentment of the proletariat and sub-proletarian classes and their cultures. Nostalgia and fetishization of some lost urban middle-class discourse revealed in the theoretical analyses of the authors related to critical Balkanologies speak to what Videkanić calls our contradictions in Serbia bourgeois civility, which reveals the bourgeois and neoliberal are yearning to be rid of what it sees as unsavory elements of the proletarian and sub-proletarian. So Videkanić argues, quote, Loginović's Eurocentric, urban-centered, and indubitably Belgrade-specific vision, with its evident antipathy towards proletarian culture, as categorically conservative and always already alloyed to academic authority, squares with the way contemporary Serbian elites want to transform and market the country, end quote. Videkanić goes on to cite Zala Volčić's study of how post-Milosevic intellectuals conceive of their identities as her informants who belong to different intellectual bourgeoisie class spheres, journalists, NGO workers, politicians, actors, and so forth, articulate their view of their world as they, quote unquote, collectively iterate an exclusionary sentiment towards proletarian and ethnicized others, minority groups, she somberly concludes, says, such as gypsies, different ethnic groups, immigrants, refugees, and all of these are excluded from the Belgrade imaginary, end quote. And I can speak to my own experience being a refugee from Bosnia as a 15-year-old child in Croatia, which used to be the same country, where I was taught how to use the toilet by my relatives in Croatia, who considered me to be too barbaric and uncivilized as to use the toilet. So all of these liberal bourgeois things are embedded in the class formation that Videkanić argues are very important. While during Yugoslav socialism, these bourgeois elitist sentiments were dampened by the socialist system, they came fully to the fore in the 1990s and breakup of Yugoslavia and the installation of the neoliberal, westernized socio-political and economic order. These, however, cannot be limited to Serbia, but they're established across the region, in fact. Why are these contexts important when we examine the region when I talk about non-alignment? Since Yugoslavia's disintegration in a series of wars in the 1990s, the histories of socialism, its internationalist project of cultural diplomacy, funding of the non-aligned movement, and attempts to foster coexistence, non-violence, anti-imperialism, and collaboration amongst various oppositional sides in the Cold War were deliberately neglected, revised, denied, and extracted from the official new histories. These past years have been, they have seen an increase in such projects, so much so that, as Živka pointed out yesterday, revisionism and denialism are rampant. What post-Yugoslav historiographies of the past 30 years for the most part offered were assessment of the Yugoslav recent and earlier past in the context of a communist symbolic order propped up by various post-structuralist theories which became entrenched in the Yugoslav academia in the 1990s. And as Videkanić also argues, revolutionary socialism, of which there's a really rich tradition in the Balkans, was displaced by either open identification with some form of ethnic ultranationalist nativism or a kind of reasoned embrace of broadly liberal and civic projects in politics. Studies of socialist Yugoslavia and its end, therefore, most of the time frame socialist history on the fall of communist representational systems, ethnic nationalism, propagandist technologies, performative categories of Yugoslavia's alleged participation in the white supremacy, theories of trauma and memory, and in some cases producing more murky discourses of mythological hatreds, or in extreme cases, crude divisionist projects that assess the region from a fascist and a crypto-fascist manner. All these very different political and theoretical projects, however, constantly refuse to address material circumstances of the socialist project, or they artificially suture socialism to war and destruction, so that at the end, as Svetlana Nadimović aptly puts it, between the 1990s and the wars between the 1980s and the war in the 90s, there's nothing else. In other words, that socialism produced the wars of the 90s without accounting for the larger processes that took place in the 10-year period. This, of course, is completely historical reading, which denies the progressive socio-political and economic decline in Yugoslavia of the 1980s, triggered by a large global crisis of capitalism that equally precipitated the decline and destruction of the welfare state in the West and various revolutionary anti-colonial projects elsewhere. Indeed, when Yugoslav socialism looked in a vacuum, ahistorically and devoid of materialist critique, it leads one to conclude, as many liberals have, that socialism was a failed project. Another issue that many such projects also do is to analyze socialist Yugoslav project and others across the world using current normative sociological, social, and theoretical values, so that projects are not taken in their own historical and social situatedness, but are taken outside of that. They're also not done in a comparative way, which I think is very important. So non-aligned modernism, as I posit in my book and in my current work, where I'm looking at politically engaged art, in which I'm looking at partisan art and naive art, or so-called amateur and popular art. I'm looking at these class-based and popular and other formations within Yugoslav socialism. And so non-aligned modernism includes these and searches or seeks to both dethrone the idea of uniform modernism in international historiography, putting Yugoslav modernism into the growing global modernism's formation, which it has been written out of, and also, in a way, dialoguing with Yugoslav own art historiography that does not or did not up until recently acknowledge socialism's influence and the influence of class, very importantly, in art history. So those are the two things. And also, of course, talking about transnational cultural networks of which and imperialism, of which this is an important part. So I can talk more, but I'm gonna stop here because I'm out of time.
Bojana, thank you so much. I mean, I can only but wholeheartedly agree with you on this. And this was one of the crucial, let's say, conflictual points between some of the members of the editorial collective of the book that we did previously in this art organization project. And that is visible in my introduction to that book. But oh my God, yes, thank you so much for this. I forgot. It's Ovidiu now. Ovidiu, could you please, take the floor and introduce us to this very interesting notion, intimate colonization, and how you conceptualize it?
Nice, thank you. Actually, listening to Bojana and yesterday to Anna, to Esther, yeah. Made me think that maybe I should have talked about another project that I'm doing on the relations of Romania with the age of decolonization, particularly, yes, regimes of visibility, also popular art, travel diaries, but also theory. But I hope it's once you turn that lid, you get spectacular things out, of course. But I hope there's going to be another place for that too. For now, I'd like though to turn to this issue of the intimate colonization, which is Can you see it now? All right. Yeah, so basically this was this idea of intimate colonization emerged for me just as a banal observation from my personal experience, looking at what was going around me in the Romanian society in the first half of the and in the migrant society, amongst diasporic Romanians, migrant workers, in the first half of the 2000s, at how this paradigmatic change that we experienced after '89 was not affecting only the institutions, the cities, the state, the university, and so on, but our very intimacy, our bodies, faces, but also the spaces, including the interior apartments, the friendships, places, and all that. And so I tried looking for other ways of conceiving and thinking this general transformation that starts from under our skin, one that would be sensitive to this kind of changes. So in a conversation where I came to this attempt to define the post-socialist transition then as, well, the move from the kitchen table to the living, right? In millions and millions of apartments throughout the former socialist bloc, right? So this huge period, the 3 decades that we've been, this was all that I could come up with. But of course, this is small movement, a few meters long, right, is a process involving the nuclear family, with changing dynamics between masculinities and femininities, frames of discourse and representation in which imported technology plays an important role, cable and satellite television. And of course, it involves a re-education, right? But, and this is where it gets more interesting, I think, maybe, this way of looking at things also makes one remember conviviality, communality, the social world of the kitchen, the non-capitalist economy of the kitchen pantry, the apartment parties, the apartment exhibitions or performances, right? So in this particular definition, then we look at this transition as a situation where the most important conversations would took place at the kitchen table, right? Around shared food in a situation of conviviality, but then moved to the indirect discourse of the living room in echoless talks with the television providing opinions, and not only opinions, but also faces, skins, and entertainment. So I think this idea of intimate colonization opens to a pluriverse of practices where coloniality and resistance are still in tension, subject to an open or unresolved dialectics. So, and this is also why it's an attempt to ask questions that situate one in the middle of the contradiction, right? Not outside it. And of course, once you're there, the point is to take a direction or decolonizing direction, if possible, which, means nothing less than working at an epistemic transformation, rethinking from the ground up of the tools and purposes of things like philosophy, cultural history, social anthropology, artistic research, institutions, and so on. Yet at the same time, with all these grand, outlooks, this is nothing extraordinary and absolutely new. And of course, it does not mean reinventing the wheel, but rather just hopping on a wheel. Epistemic refoundation is quite common as a gesture in the global South, right? Due to the double erasure of coloniality. As mentioned by Rolando Vazquez and Walter Mignolo, the erasure not only of the histories of the colonized people, but the erasure of the erasure itself, which then is replaced with an apparatus of representation that first classifies the other and then makes visible the splendor of the universal standpoint of the history of humanity seen as a history of the rise of the West, right? And as a process of reaching the freedom peaks of the sovereign self. We see this not in the least in the position of the genius artist or the theorist who can be in the vanguard of history. Now, this apparatus of representation, which is built on erasure and stolen memories, of course, can be still seen all over the grand Western museums and smaller galleries, but also has been replicated in Central and Eastern Europe in its institutions of representation and knowledge. In this recent history of the transition to capitalism, the double erasure of coloniality could be observed in our region, for instance, in the refoundation of feminism in Eastern Europe under the guidance of liberal white Western feminists. The network NEWW was mentioned yesterday, which became quickly a civilizational program based on Western liberal values, which operated on a tabula rasa of the local histories of women, the local histories of gender. And a similar history can be observed in the history of the promotion of human rights in parallel with the dehumanization of East Europeans in the 1990s. And the production, also in parallel with the production of post-communist racism. Coloniality of power came to be articulated in Eastern Europe after '89, firstly through the bottleneck of anti-communism, which also made all the universe of local anti-colonialisms, anti-racisms, women emancipation, and also eco-social thought, they made all that invisible and erased from histories, even from archives, as I found out, and finally, of course, from memory. Now, the question of the recovery of this erased histories of reconnection, reconstitution, reactualization, as we heard yesterday, is essential to defining East European or East Central positionality within a history that was partially erased, right, or subject to oppression and marginalization, in a world which is going through possibly another paradigmatic transition, right? But this reconnection is complicated. It often cannot start from the existing archives and collections. Yes, there may be one anti-colonial museum in Belgrade, as problematic as it is, but it's a very rare institution. And the archives like this are all are very rare or spread out or dissipated. So also, of course, the quest for reconstitution, as we know very well, can take the dangerous path that looks for authenticity and purity of origins, which is not what we want. And this is where the concept of intimate colonization, I think, is useful, because it's messy. It's a messy concept. Intimate colonization is dirty and turns the gray zone, the in-betweenness of East Europeans into a positive instrument. It considers the intricate and nested ways that Eastern Europe has been subject to coloniality, and proposes a concrete way of working with the cultural archive of our region, which points both to deep processes of internalization and involvement or complicity to coloniality, right? But also opens to local resources of inventivity, resistance, and even decolonization, right? So across intimate colonization as a concept, there's not another concept, which would be decolonial, but a universe of resources, practices, gestures, and names. In recent history, I think the kitchen pantry, the kitchen table, the migrant bus, the backyard garden, the car playlist, these are some of the other kind of sites of archives in which a different history is condensed and leaves traces, written at a more intimate level. When Pavel Brăila, these are some of the faces, right, after '89 and in the Romanian public sphere. And I was fascinated with how all of a sudden intellectuals started sporting interwar haircuts. And so as if all of a sudden after '89, we returned to the '30s. And then how on the other hand, you had from popular music, all this upsurge of mimicry, but in the direction of creolization, which I found very interesting if you look at it in context. So for instance, when Pavel Brăila brings the local staple food, sarmale, right, in the center of a Berlin gallery, his performance video, Eurolines Catering, Homesick Cuisine in 2006, basically he opens the camera to a social history that was not studied at the time by sociology or migration studies. And actually it's still not seen in all its complexity or multiscalarity. Well, since the Eurolines buses were the cheapest way to travel from Chisinau to Berlin, they also became the migrant post, being used for transporting goods and documents and back for sending money. And so Pavel Brejla asked his mother to cook for his opening in Berlin, which meant his debut as an artist, right? Working debut as an artist. And he asked her to send the freshly cooked food to the opening in the belly of the bus, documenting the whole process, including the bus stopping in front of the doors of the gallery, and then how the Westerners also ate it all, right? Now, intimate colonization doesn't refer just to small scale or closeness, right? I think you noticed that also from Pavel Brejla's example. And it's not something new, of course. In the West, I won't go through the theoretical basis, but when I was looking at it, actually, I started from Louis Althusser and the idea of ideology as material, touching our bodies and minds, his example of the table manners. And then, of course, Norbert Elias with the internalization of social rules into habits. And then Guattari and Deleuze with the Oedipus, which they called our intimate colonial education, which means basically that this tendency of Western Eurocentric tendency of seeing every society going through a transition from childhood to maturity, from pre-Oedipal structures to Oedipal structures, which in turn means seeing any society through the lens of the Western nuclear family and Western middle class, the liberal bourgeois. And so if capitalism, according to them, then could be understood as a domain of intimate colonization, then we can work with that. Now, of course, if the more we got in touch with thinkers from the South, you see how the difficulty of getting out of this process is something that comes to fore. And I won't go through through the theoretical parts, but well, Fanon, of course, Gloria Anzaldúa, Renato Constantino, and Ashish Nandi and Maria Lugones were important for me. But I think Central and East European migrant workers, scholars, artists, and cultural workers can all relate intuitively to this idea, which is important. It doesn't have to be a very armored concept, right? And they can, people I think can relate intuitively to this and can take a position, and by taking a position in the spaces of intimate colonization, this opens both to co-reasoning in transperipheral relations and to a rethinking of the relations to the West without falling to idealist hopes. As we know, Eastern Europe has been touched by coloniality in very complex ways as it stands in the borderlands of inter-imperiality, which means, for instance, that humor itself or sensibilities are split between Western, Ottoman, Byzantine, Balkan kind of articulations, as we know. And after the national liberation and the formation of the modern state, of course, it has not been innocent, but has participated in dreams as well as in actual projects imbued by coloniality. These deep layers have come to play an important role after '89, when Eastern Europe and Central Europe has gone west with bodies and minds, inculcating wideness, Americanization, the idea of high civilization, and also all that stands opposite to these constructs. So proposing this problem of intimate colonization in this wider frame then means also looking for ways to regain an involved political self while also decolonizing the cultural archive of the region. In relation to the transition to capitalism, the period after '89, I think that an essential part of this paradigmatic transformation has been the colonial education, the establishment of Eurocentrism and Westcentrism as dominant cultural ideologies. And this process did not, again, change or affect only the institutions of governing knowledge and representation, but also the worlds of intimacy and those the roots of the communal self, of social intercourse, and of solidarity. A few particular doors can be, I would point to, that are opened by the question of intimate colonization, and inviting you thus to share and enrich this path from your own domains of work. One, the control of sensibility and the normalization of perception. Thus, phenomena such as the hypersexualization of women were normalized in the 90s and 2000s, but also an entire visual colonial education which came to being after '89 on all the foundations, but still. And this included the aestheticization of poverty, right? However, if you look at them closely, all these episodes of intimate colonization have been resisted by countercultural phenomena, such as positive sexuality, creolization in music, and what I would call the class suicide of independent cultural workers. And such phenomena are crucial to understanding the deep tendencies of our societies and our resources, and I think are still underutilized directions of social science and artistic research. The second door opened would be further research on the socialization of genders, the making of masculinities and femininities, particularly in the relation to the re-emergence of the nuclear family in the ideology of the state in the region, right? And the ethno-nationalist phantasms of ancient imperial selves, which are now all over the region coming back. But also in relation to other phenomena, such as the which bring back the context, the wider context of Europe, and discussion of what Europe is, as Manuela says, the commodification of the East European woman in Western culture and economy, or the constant invention of local inferior men throughout the region, uncivilized, uncouth, darker, bad teeth, right? There's many categories that are used to create this permanently needed category of local inferior men, who then are eliminated from spaces of representation. A third would be the racialization of East Europeans, as well as the creation of whiteness, the destruction of non-capitalist economies, and the coloniality of food. And I would point also at the end to one final door opened, the confidential communities. As you may remember, Victor Misiano, the Russian art critic, called confidential communities basically the alternative spaces where art and critical thought actually happened in the worst years of the Soviet society, referring not only to the apartment exhibitions, but to the apartment as the social center that kind of replaced the public sphere at a time when the public sphere was ideologized to a very intense degree. So I propose that you can see actually the confidential communities all throughout the former socialist bloc as vernacular products of that side of socialism which deviated from the Western path of modernity. Right? And so, for instance, the universe of disco parties during socialism, the tea evenings in the apartments, the social networks of women in the apartments at the block, the social universe of internal tourist destinations in the mountains or the seaside where intimacy met with state socialist planning. All these confidential communities have been deeply affected and destroyed in the transition to capitalism, right? We're not talking only about factories being closed and families being destroyed, but whole ways of being of the social and of the communal in our region that they were destroyed. And I think confidential communities were some of the first that were destroyed. And of course, the current domination of social media plays a role into this, the continuation of this destruction. So where are the new confidential communities and what are they creating? How can they be scaled? Would be a question for each one of us, I guess. So, of course, after any colonization, what is needed is also a perceptual, re-alphabetization. This idea of intimate colonization opens to I think, to attention which is both personal and social, and opens a process of revaluing the devalued social and communal. And my hope that it also helps one regain or affirm the ethical direction of one's work, including the artistic work, and that it also situates the social importance of artistic work in a more poignant context. I'm ending with this image of books that show the part of the relation of Romanian public sphere during socialism with African and indigenous thought that came to be aestheticized, right? So this is kind of like the part that instituted a distance as opposed to co-thinking. And I think we are still here. This emerged in Romania in the late 70s and was very dominant in the 80s. So basically after the decade of decolonization. And this kind of aestheticization, I think, is still it's a history that crosses the 1989, the year of rupture. Usually, I think it crosses, and it's one of the blocks that I think we have to remove in order to regain this access to co-thinking or co-reasoning with the South and regaining what is juicy about intimacy, right? All right, I'll stop here, and thank you.
Thank you, Ovidiu. This was so beautiful, and I think this is very useful. It actually gives us tools to think about something that we still didn't mention, and this is like also, in a way, like how the internal relations of the countries in the East Europe also reconceptualized. And this, I think, from the very, how to say, intimate perspective of someone who used to live in between Bulgaria and Serbia and what was happening in this train. But I will leave this story for later, and I will give the word to Čarna now to tell us about her research on humanitarianism in, let's say, non-aligned world and in the Europeanized world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Ana, so much. I mean, I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad that this set of conversations is taking place. I'm really glad that it is taking place outside of academia, that is being made somehow streamed online, that it's available later online to watch it. It will be also translated, published, and so on. So I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I will now share my screen and start the presentation. So I have decided, the term I have chosen to speak about is humanitarianism. And why humanitarianism? When Ana invited me to speak here today, I was uncertain whether to talk about decolonizing the human from the perspective of Southeast Europe, because when you say decolonizing the human, it seems more somehow conceptually interesting, more somehow politically exciting, more theoretically relevant. Thinking about how to decolonize the human, let's say, from the perspective of Southeast Europe would also maybe be more in the line with the invitation of this workshop to think in prescriptive terms. So how to do something? What do we need to do to decolonize an art organization? What should we change in our organizational praxis to pursue a better world? At the same time, also, many people on the left in feminist and queer circles, for example, are already critical of humanitarianism and see it as a part of the liberal political project. and my own discipline, cultural anthropology, has also developed over the last 20 years a very strong, very justified critique of humanitarianism as a project that is practically impossible. It is somehow that promises more than it can deliver. A project that is premised upon hierarchies of humanity that were inherited from the colonial era and that today also reproduce coloniality. I have still decided to speak about humanitarianism today for two reasons. And the first one is that humanitarianism has planetary aspirations, let's say. So humanitarianism as a framework of helping, as a framework of relating to people across the world, aims to be inclusive and global. And I personally believe that we should not let liberal capitalist ideology to be seen as the only framework that has these kinds of aspirations, as the only political project that is about sharing across cultural differences and across regional and national particularities. And I'm personally interested in exploring, in studying moral frameworks and political frameworks that also strive to be universal, that also strive somehow to be shared on a planetary level, but that do not follow the coordinates of liberal capitalism. So this would be somehow the first reason, this claim to universality, this aspiration to be shared globally. The second reason is that because studying what humanitarianism means in Southeast Europe captures the complex and ambivalent position of this region in the broader decolonial framework. And I will speak here today about how the Red Cross in socialist Yugoslavia developed its own version of socialist humanitarianism, let's call it, as an alternative to the liberal humanitarian intervention. I will describe this relatively brief historical episode from the 1970s in which the Yugoslav Red Cross wanted to inspire the international Red Cross movement to transform itself internally and to do a different kind of humanitarianism, a humanitarianism that would be inspired by somehow socialist and non-aligned projects and political vocabularies. And this socialist humanitarianism presented an alternative to the liberal humanitarianism, let's say, because it stemmed out of the premises of socialist modernity rather than out of premises of liberal modernity. However, it still stemmed out of a form of modernity. So it was still a form of an intervention and a developmental project on its own. And this ambivalence reflects something that I would say many of us who are here in this room today agree with, that somehow Southeast Europe sits awkwardly in these conversations on decolonization. And the reason for this awkwardness in my discipline, cultural anthropology, is an uncertainty over whether socialist modernity should be understood as a version of Western European modernity coloniality, or as its other, as a sort of a promising alternative to it. And there are some authors who suggest that socialism was a form of modernity, and as a form of modernity, it cannot provide us with the necessary tools to somehow, conceptual tools, to imagine the world differently beyond this modernity coloniality nexus in a radically non-Eurocentric way. So from this perspective, decolonial approach means looking for non-modern ways of knowledge and being, somehow unearthing, trying to discover, recover, subaltern, indigenous forms of knowledge and being. And this is a very popular approach in cultural anthropology. It means somehow studying these indigenous native forms of knowledge and being that have been ignored and silenced both by socialist modernity and by capitalist modernity. There is another strand of thought about decoloniality and cultural anthropology. And in it, the point is not to seek this somehow indigenous, non-modern perspective position as a place of innocence and purity. The point is not to somehow disconnect from the world, which includes this modernity coloniality nexus. Instead, the aim is to embrace the multiplicity of the world, to creolize the world, or to somehow think also about socialist modernism, as Bojana and Manuela have been talking about. So to include its somehow multiple modernities while keeping in mind and keeping visible somehow power differences and hierarchies. And think here also of the approach of Achille Mbembe. And this second approach is much more useful, I would say, for thinking about humanitarianism from a Southeast European perspective. Katarina Kušić writes that Southeast Europe is a region of what she calls complex differences. I mean, it's such a great term, complex differences, because differences between the Yugoslav Red Cross and the International Red Cross movement and somehow ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, and so on, were not simple. These were like complex differences. They were grounded in difficult histories of colonialism and socialism in complicated ways. And in my reading, Decolonizing Humanitarianism, does not mean taking socialist humanitarianism as a sort of a progressive alternative to the liberal humanitarianism. It means instead exploring how these different frameworks of helping intersected with one another and with what consequences and what they made possible and what they prevented from happening. So these complex differences somehow ask us to follow social complexity and ambiguity while keeping in mind socioeconomic hierarchies and power inequalities. And let me illustrate this a little bit with my empirical material. So in the 1970s, the Red Cross of Yugoslavia actively intervened in the international humanitarian discourses. It started organizing a series of activities with an aim to, as they said in one of their reports, determine the role of the Red Cross in the struggle against racism and racial discrimination. And one of those activities was the first Red Cross Peace Conference that was held in Belgrade in 1975. And some 220 delegates from 8 international Red Cross societies, international organizations of the Red Cross took part. And the Red Cross of Yugoslavia organized this conference in order to promote the non-aligned perspective, let's say, on peace within the international Red Cross movement. And for that purpose, they somehow developed an alternative vocabulary of humanitarianism, which I think it's sort of an attempt to develop an alternative also political philosophy of humanitarianism. So during the conference, the Red Cross of Yugoslavia challenged the dominant Red Cross ideas about peace, about neutrality, and humanitarian law. So these were the 3 key terms that they were somehow trying to redefine. And it asked the International Red Cross to change these ideas in a way that would encompass the historical experiences of the non-aligned countries. And the Yugoslav Red Cross claimed there is a distinction between what they called, and you can see this on the screen, the quote that is circled. There's a distinction between a peace of the conquerors and aggressors, keeping other peoples in subjugation until they rise in revolt on the one hand, and on the other hand, a peace founded upon certain principles such as justice, equality, equity, and the right to self-determination. And in the background of this idea of this distinction was an idea that the world was inhabited by peoples, nations, located in profoundly unequal positions, and a simple absence of violence is not really a reflection of respect for fellow humans. From the perspective of the Yugoslav Red Cross, as long as the colonial or fascist governance is kept intact, absence of violence does not mean much, it's not really a humanitarian goal. As a humanitarian organization, the Red Cross must support peace that is founded upon respect for shared humanity of unequally positioned people. And this was the main argument of the Yugoslav delegation. So peace is not an absence of violence, but a dynamic process of cooperation between peoples. And on the basis of this understanding of peace, the Red Cross of Yugoslavia also redefines somehow what it means to be apolitical. So they claim that neutrality is impossible, but that humanitarian organizations should be apolitical. I don't have the time to explain this in a lot of detail, but they did develop this somehow particular political philosophical vocabulary, let's say, of peace, humanitarianism, being political versus being apolitical, and humanitarian law. And when I present pieces of this research to various audiences, there is always someone who says, well, this is all interesting, but it's not really humanitarianism. This is development, and this is politics, or this is solidarity in our somehow contemporary terms. And I mean, sure, this was not humanitarianism as we usually think about it, as the liberal bourgeois project of the first world that replays a debt to the third world through colonial, that it was incurred through colonialism and slavery and so on. And the boundary between the politics and that which is not the politics here is not somehow positioned in the same way. But this was still humanitarianism from the perspective of the Red Cross of Yugoslavia. And this is what I find so interesting about it. This was a different way of imagining how moral relations within the world should be forged. Here, liberation, so decolonial liberation was seen as a humanitarian goal. It was seen as the moral imperative for the humanity as a whole, like for the humanity as a community, basically as a global community. The International Red Cross does not need to work towards liberation of the former colonies, but then it is not really working for the sake of humanity. It is not really being humanitarian. So humanitarianism here means somehow pursuing social change on a global level, creating a more humane, more just, better society globally. So socialist humanitarianism has this focus on social change. And here the task for a humanitarian organization is to support global social transformation, not just to keep the world going by saving lives, but to create a new world. And on the screen, we can see photographs and earlier some citations from a booklet that the Red Cross of Yugoslavia published in 1976. It was called Peace and the Red Cross. And they published this in order to present this proposal for how to redefine peace work within the International Red Cross movement to their partners. Sorry. And right, so the Red Cross of Yugoslavia tried to provoke the change within this International Red Cross movement practically, so not just in the domain of rhetoric and visual representation and so on, but through actual practices. And they did so in two ways. First, they organized blood donations for the non-aligned countries that were undergoing liberation struggles, such as India or Egypt. And second, they started the so-called Red Cross Center for the Education of Developing and Non-Aligned Countries and Liberation Movements. And the aim of this center for the education was to teach the partners from the non-aligned world how to set up their own Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. And the center organized international seminars that were attended by the participants from 42 countries, from Africa and Asia, and from 6 liberation movements. And both of these humanitarian initiatives of the Yugoslav Red Cross, so both the blood donations and this educational center, the training program, were part of a Yugoslav attempt to establish new networks of circulation of moral sentiment and humanitarian objects globally. So they tried to convince the International Red Cross movement to change their foundational principles. And they also tried to create a new stickiness somehow in the world, to create new networks of circulation of humanitarian sentiments and objects. And this is also where many problems emerge. So for instance, all the participants of these seminars of the Red Cross Center for the Education were, and this is a quote, all the participants were fully medically examined upon the arrival because most came from tropical areas. Their possible medical treatment was done in parallel with lectures on frequent tropical diseases. And I mean this moment where you invite people from Africa and Asia to come to Belgrade to educate them how to organize a humanitarian organization. And then you medically examine them for tropical diseases. This is where we can see very clearly that socialist humanitarianism was a project that somehow still operated within the coordinates of the European modernity coloniality nexus. It had this revolutionary aim to reorganize the world, to create new networks of circulation of moral sentiments, but it also drew its political imagination from the repertoires of European modernity. So what is this episode, this relatively brief episode in the history of the Red Cross in the Balkans tell us about the coloniality and social justice more broadly? I believe that it shows very clearly that in Yugoslavia, there was a sense of entitlement to participate in global conversations as an equal participant. And I believe that this episode illustrates that political elites in socialist Yugoslavia felt that they had the right to be regional political thinkers, to offer new ways of understanding the key political and moral terms of their time, and to try to convince other actors in the global scene to adopt those new terms. That being said, the moral vocabulary that the Red Cross of Yugoslavia created and offered to others must be approached critically for various reasons. First, this socialist humanitarianism is somehow inseparable from the national order of things. It was about helping not just fellow humans, but fellow nations in need. Second, their project had this political imagination of European modernity in the background. So this idea of the world is divided into a family of nations. And third, this network of circulation of humanitarian sentiment was directed outwards. The Red Cross work within the country, within socialist Yugoslavia, was much less racially conscious, let's say, and much less revolutionary. So in terms of the content of the vocabulary that they developed, I think we have to study it and to study it critically. However, the sense of having the right to take part in global conversations as an equal participant, as a producer of knowledge, this is something that is, I believe, so inspiring to so many of us today. This is something that has also been lost today with the transformation of the region into European periphery. For instance, let me just make a brief parallel. In 2015, there was an earthquake in Nepal, and Deutsche Telekom, and then its daughter organization, Montenegrin Telecom, started a humanitarian action in Montenegro, inviting people to donate money for people who were struck by this earthquake in Nepal. And this humanitarian action provoked an explosion of sarcastic memes that satirized the very possibility of a connection between Nepal and Montenegro. So the very possibility that people in Montenegro can do something that would be helpful for Nepal sounded somehow ridiculous. And I think this shows somehow that humanitarian affect itself, the moral sentiment itself, has changed in this region with its transformation into a global periphery. And from that perspective, I will end here. Yugoslav attempts to redefine humanitarianism, peace work, and neutrality are both somehow inspiring and reflective of the awkward and ambivalent position of Southeast Europe more generally in the decolonial framework. I'll end here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Čarna. This was great. I mean, you really pinpoint to this important thing of reading the concepts like situated like historically, and because what is happening generally in the analysis is usually that this gets somehow lost, and yeah, this can be applied to, I don't know, like everything that we do, so to say. So thank you all very much for these wonderful presentations. I just wanted to ask you if you feel like having a comfort break, or you are also very eager to continue discussion, or we can just say if someone needs to go, he goes and or she goes and comes back, and we continue discussing. Huh? Break, or who votes for break? No one. Okay, we continue. Okay, so I would like to suggest this format that we also had on the previous conversations, and this is like a small internal discussion within the presenters. So I will leave my comments for later and ask Manuela if she would like to raise any questions or like ask anything to other participants of this panel.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's hard to start because I'm still kind of digesting it all. Maybe the easiest is to start with the last ideas that Čarna put into my mind regarding humanitarianism, but it does relate to all the presentations, because I think there was a very nice red thread going through this panel. So you brought us together well. I was thinking about the notion of humanitarianism and the contention that it doesn't do the same thing to save humanity as in the dominant understanding, as a critique. Doesn't it, or isn't it telling that what was actually being negotiated is not so much the outcome for humanity, but the notion of the human? Because that would, for me, connect also to Ovidiu's presentation, the kind of who gets to define what terms are at stake. If what was being negotiated, or what would count as a form of socialist modernity in terms of redefining humanitarianism in a different way, is not about redefining development aid or redefining aid, but about redefining who is the human that is in need of help or able to help, who is a subject, who is a political decision maker. And maybe that is the core, or I don't know how you see it, what the core of what would make socialist modernity a different modernity. I'm not so sure that this is compatible with modernity coloniality. If we start having multiple modernities, that's different than a modernity that's inflected by coloniality. But maybe that's a whole kind of its own discussion. But about the human, I don't know if you think the humanitarianism and redefining it was about humanity at all, or was a possibility of a new claim of redefining the human. That would turn to also Ovidiu's presentation with what is intimate, because then the dominant understanding of the intimate would be almost the private public differentiation, but then the intimate colonization is a way of challenging that. You're not saying private, you're saying, and you're not saying domestic, you're saying intimate, but you're not saying sexual or bodily. So could you flesh that out more in terms of what does that do to challenge the dominant distinctions? I'll leave it at that and think some more. Thank you.
Shall I answer now, or yeah? I mean, just very briefly, I think that the way in which they somehow, in these narratives that I was reading, these reports and plans and conference speeches and so on, the way in which they define this boundary between what is political and what is non-political, I think this was very different from the socialist perspective, because they said, so, okay, there is politics, and politics is an interested-oriented somehow pursuit of like particularistic interests, and being apolitical means supporting the human. And there was this, I think, there is a disconnect also between somehow, on the one hand, the belief that being apolitical means supporting the human and humane somehow forms of life and so on, and at the same time, the way in which they organizationally focused on the countries and development, the societies in information and so on. And there was no attempt, because I think this was such a brief attempt and didn't last longer than 10 years and so on. There was no attempt to reconcile somehow this focus on an attempt to redefine the humane practices and the human, and the fact that somehow in terms of the organizational like plans and so on, they very much follow the family of nations. The picture of the world is divided into countries and so on. So it's not like a very well developed, unfortunately, political philosophy, but there are things that are interesting somehow to unpack and to understand. And I agree. I mean, somewhere in this redefinition between like what was understood as political and as apolitical, this was specific to this was somehow shaped by socialist ideas.
Thank you both, Čarna and Manuela, for this exchange. I don't know, maybe, I mean, I can tell my story now, so maybe this will lead us somewhere. I was just thinking, when, I mean, like connected to everything that I heard, like from the very beginning to the very end, I just had this like flash from the past when it was like the moment just before the Bulgaria was entering the European Union. And I was living between, I was living partly in Serbia and partly in Bulgaria, and I was traveling with this train. And I experienced in this train like part of this transition process, so to say, or like change that was happening. So from my memories, like from the socialist Yugoslavian times, there was a kind of prejudice against the people from Romania and Bulgaria. They were seen like, you know, like poor people that needed some help. And this connects a little bit, you know, like who is the human who needs help in this story. And then, you know, this like drastically changed in this very short period on this train where I was traveling. And I experienced it, you know, like with all of these women that were traveling from Serbia to Bulgaria to buy cheap stuff, you know, like, and then resend it in Serbia and earn a little bit of surplus to be able to, you know, in this horrible crisis, like to sustain their families. And I was there like, you know, like, I don't know, like people, I mean, majority of the people that were on these trains were like these small smugglers, like people that were trying to survive on this kind of work that they were doing. And I would usually be, you know, like the kind of like accomplice in this process. So they would ask me just to wear as much things as I can on top of me for them in order to be able to cross the border. So I would end up, you know, like wearing 3 t-shirts, 5 sweaters, and 3 jackets, you know, just to, you know, to help them, you know, or taking like some steka of cigars, you know, with me because they could just take as much. So I was thinking about how, you know, like from what Manuela was saying at the beginning, you know, like how the cartography, you know, like the colors of the Europe were changing, what was happening, you know, like between, you know, these countries that were like changing colors with a delay, so to say, or some of them are still in, you know, like very shades of gray. And, you know, like how can we look at this from all of these angles? Because this is not also like we are talking about these processes as they are equal, you know, like we are still, you know, like somehow looking at the East Europe as, you know, like something that is not very much diversified, but in the matter of fact, it is. So I don't know, I would just like to raise these questions about these like differences. So I don't know who would like to say something on that. Ovidiu, maybe you can start.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with a few questions and then I'll also say something. I mean, I wanted to ask, Manuela, about you know, the darker, getting darker and darker in the story of the unequal Europes. You know, if we go along this classification, then how are we to see the processes of dehumanization and racialization across them, right? If you can talk a little bit about that. And I wanted to ask you, Bena, if you in this discussion on non-aligned modernism, if you encountered this topic of the elite worker as a creator of hierarchy within the factory, the working place, and the elite worker as a model kind of socialist modernism. I don't know if it's something that I stumbled on recently, and I still cannot wrap my head around it. And I wonder if you also encountered it. And then, wait a minute, I wanted to also, Čarna, to ask you about this, well, again, the difference between liberal humanism and socialist humanism, right? After 89, the aid to Eastern Europe was mostly actually financial and for the destruction of industry, right? So World Bank and then USAID actually gave money for the closure of mines, factories, and I think there's a stat that shows about 15% was actual aid. And so if you look at it structurally, then the liberal humanitarianism shows this kind of side. But I wonder if you have any idea about socialist humanitarianism, if you look at it in its own scale, you know. And finally, I just wanted to say something about this question, the Manuela. Yeah, of course, you know, this idea of the intimacy kind of transgresses this public-private consciousness, the world outside, and all these dichotomies. But I think the best way to kind of see it at work is through examples, you know, this how it kind of creates a different distribution of the social and the communal. For instance, this issue with the kitchen pantry, right? So, Kamara, this thing that you know, before 89 there was every apartment block. I'm not even talking about the houses, right? But the pantry at the apartment block, they had this kitchen pantry with things put for the winter, right? So conserves and all kinds of things, right? And this, in themselves, then open to a very interesting universe of relations, because we're talking about knowledge, you know, recipes, we're talking about social relations, this coming through families, but also in networks in the neighborhood, networks between the women living in the same block or the neighbors, a completely different distribution of the social that you can notice there. Like, if I would ask my mother, all right, how was this? How did we do it? Because it was a we of which I was unaware because it was organized by somebody else. And that, of course, was my mother, right? And so the main the knowledge producers then, when also organizers were sort of like a collective of women, right, in the neighborhood that would co-organize when to go to the market, would talk about their sources, right, of food stuff, recipes, all this kind of stuff, right? So all of a sudden, and this also this exchange of recipes would take place in the kitchen, right, in the kitchen table in the mornings, at the tea or coffee or whatever. And this meant also that the space of the nuclear family was broken into, right, by this network of women, right? And that, of course, was tolerated in some places, not tolerated in others, right? Turned into domestic violence in some cases. So this all of a sudden, this question of intimacy then offers us, I think, a different distribution of the social, a different kind of consciousness, right? And this whole public-private distinction takes on a completely different meaning. For instance, what were the books? Not only, okay, what was the knowledge first, but then what was the books? I only, later I found this recipe books and papers with recipes that were exchanged, and not all of them had, of course, my mother's writing, right? Then yes, all kinds of sources of knowledge that were exchanged, and which included also literature, of course, but and newspapers and almanacs that had all kinds of things, right? But you can see that even the production of books themselves at the level of from top to bottom actually listened to or followed a little bit this other world. The almanacs and were actually made basically for this world. This every year you have right at the end this production from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, this explosion of almanacs. The almanac of the woman, the almanac of the journal, I don't know what, like everybody was producing almanacs, but what these almanacs were, of course, was basically an entire universe of, a different distribution of the private and the public and the communal. And basically how to organize your life in a different way, not taking into consideration the state even, or other factors of power. So I think, this is the kind of universe that I think opens up once we replace, public, private, and all that with intimacy. And with sexuality is also interesting because it opens towards the socialization of sex. So towards the making of gender, and not to gender in itself as a category, but into the making of it. So, okay, but that's a different discussion.
Thank you, Ovidiu. And Bojana, because I know that you have to leave earlier, would you like to pose any questions to any of the participants, or answer any of the questions that were already posed?
So just as we were sitting, I got a notice that my guests are not coming, so I have time.
Okay.
But I will. So I'm free. But I wanted to kind of touch upon a couple of things, or comment and ask a question or two. But I wanted to comment on this idea of socialist modernity and modernism. So in my case, when I talk about socialist modernism, I'm thinking about art in particular. So, but of course, this is related to the larger issues of modernization as a social political project. And as I said in my introduction, socialism created a materially different basis for creation of not to say that there weren't, and this is, some people have taken that my work argues that there was no Western influences in socialist modernism. Of course there was. Modernism is a hegemony that has entered all different spheres across the world. So all countries outside of Western modernism had to grapple with the same question: what do we do with this? As did people in Yugoslavia. And I'm always sort of because of what you said, Ana, and I think others have said the same. Eastern Europe is not a monolithic thing. I always preface that I'm talking about Yugoslavia or possibly Western Balkans, but I don't go into other countries because this Yugoslavia also within that history of socialism and Eastern Europe had a very particular, history. So socialist modernism qualitatively and quantitatively had a different experience, like life as we, as Ovidiu has just pointed out, like intimate relationships. Life itself was organized in a different way. For example, just like banal example is, my parents are doctors, and I grew up in a 56 square meter apartment in an apartment building, like the regular block apartment buildings with office workers and factory workers who were my mom's and dad's friends. So these people were regularly in our house. We were in their houses. We ate and we sat together. So when I moved to the West, what struck me the most, which sort of, I moved because of the war, what struck me the most was the class differentiation. The fact that if I was born in the West, I would never have sat with someone for working in factories because my parents, as two doctors, would never allow themselves to be that way, right? So just the experience of life in which you mingle with different classes is experientially very different. And this is one of the great contributions of socialism, which I will never allow, to kind of, and again, this is talking about particular form of life, and not everybody in socialism, of course, live that way. And as I said in my own presentation, there was like liberals at all stages of Yugoslav, this kind of liberal elites who abhorred that kind of life, like who actually thought that this was horrible for them to be involved. So looking at it, socialist modernism was always political, right? Even in its apolitical state, even looking at like history of art, where you have like art, like modernist art, you have like the modernism and what it means, it's still political. For just the virtue of some of the people who participated in creating artworks that were, let's say, abstract and seemingly uninvolved with politics, were themselves political and were communists, and fought in World War II. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So those are all very important things. And I think this kind of leads me to the question to Čarna, which is like this idea of political, what is political and what is apolitical, right? So even when we talk about apolitical nature, we're actually talking about politics because it's intervening into politics. And I think that Yugoslavs in many ways weren't afraid of that. One thing that I found in the archival research that I'm doing, for example, really great publication was done in 2013 about Algerian Yugoslav relations. And in that archival research, what you encounter is Yugoslav saying to the Algerians, you can't take our model of socialism and replicate it in Algeria. This is just one model, but you need to find your own version of socialism. We can't tell you what to do. We can show what happened to us, but we can't tell you what to do, which is very interesting to me. And it speaks to different kinds of relationships to these transnational, links. So that's another, maybe that's something we can think about. And finally, in terms of Yugoslavia, and this idea of like the relationship to the rest of the world, Yugoslav Communist Party had very clear anti-imperialist positionality prior to Nonaligned, prior to World War II. This is why I'm keep historicizing this. Nonaligned didn't come as a nice little kind of way for Yugoslavia to center itself on the world stage. No, Yugoslav communists were part and parcel of the anti-imperialist movements since the 1920s. In fact, the League of Anti-Imperialist and Anti-Colonialists in 1929 talks about Yugoslavia and Balkan states in one of its proclamations. in terms of its sitting again as a kind of prey to imperialist powers. So, you know, Communist Party of Yugoslavia participated in all this. It's nothing new. This is a continuation. It's a longer history. And so I think that there's a really rightful place for both Yugoslav modernism in artistic, but in other ways that it should take place. And the question of modernism, of course, in post-colonial thinking has been taken up to say, well, there's multiple ways that people have engaged with modernism. There's no one way that modernism exists in the world, and we need to disassociate it, I think, as Čarna said, from this idea of colonial, that modernism equals colonialism, because it's not always the case. And it was taken up by Marxists in the colonies and as part of the revolutionary anti-colonial movements in such a way.
Thanks, Bojana. Manuela, would you like to continue on this and answer maybe the question that Ovidiu posed to you at some point, if you didn't forget?
Right. Wow. Thanks for keeping track so well. Yeah. So the question was about dehumanization and racialization with respect to unequal Europes. And thanks, because that would be an opportunity to expand on stuff that I didn't get to talk about. Of course, a lot of these categories collapse once we move away from geography and the kind of, although the geographical and the geopolitical divisions are constructs themselves, they still obscure and they still overlap with other divisions. So crisscrossing these unequal Europes is, of course, a Black Europe, right? The idea, the unthinkable idea that there is such a thing as a Black Europe, but of course we know there is. For a long time, and of course it still has to be said, right? It's a marked category, as Maria Todorova would say. It's you have to say it, because if you don't say Black Europe, you presuppose a white one. But Black Europe is one reality. Now the racialization and dehumanization and enslavement of the Roma is another very entrenched, very long-term reality that has to do with what I call the complicit role of the epigonal Europe, of the southeast of Europe, with coloniality. It's not just the southeast, it's a lot of all the other Europes that were still very much benefiting from coloniality, very much in the sense that they were ambivalent as to the advantages of colonialism, be it migration, be it the possibility to gain a life in the Americas and come back and build a house, because they could pass for white. They could only do so because there was this other non-whiteness that you could dwell upon. There was this idea of Christianity and of having been the bulwark of Christianity, as Eastern Europe, so many countries in Eastern Europe have always kind of highlighted. We have stopped the Muslims from entering Europe, but this whole construction of Christianity as whiteness and as Europeanness was also premised on having, at least in Moldavia and Wallachia, Roma enslaved people who built the monasteries that were upholding the Christian identity. So this other unequal Europe is even more invisible than others, right? So, and they all crisscross, because we don't just have Roma in Romania and Moldavia. We have an entire Roma population. We have an entire Black European population that does not count as Europe, and that constantly gets interrogated as to their Europeanness, to their belonging, and so on and so forth. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask the question. But I also have maybe a short question for Bojana, because I was thinking in terms of the non-aligned modernism. You explained it very well with your material. I don't deal with modernism in sociology, but the kind of work that Ana mentioned in the beginning that I do with Anca Purvulescu, who is a literary scholar, very much has to do with creolizing the modern in understanding what it is that counts as modernist literature, for instance. And a lot of it had to do, in Romania at least, with upholding the idea that something is, a specific novel that we're looking at is the first Romanian novel, the first modern Romanian novel, because it's the epitome of modernism, although it deals with a village. So the idea that the village can be modern and making modernist literature on this material was in itself revolutionary. Does that, it's political in a different way, but I would see it as a similar or a parallel way of being non-aligned, non-aligned with the urban, with the idea of civilization, of industrialization. That's a long shot, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, I think this is really interesting. This is why I'm working on naive art right now, and because this is the sort of, this is a very complex question about naive art that I find, as I'm reading more and more, it's becoming more and more interesting, because Yugoslav, part of the Yugoslav international exchange was to send naive art concomitantly with sort of professional art. I don't know, like I'm trying to find proper wording, which deals with this rural-urban divide, and very much as a class divide. So before World War II, there was a kind of a movement in Yugoslavia for, amongst the writers and the artists, visual artists, for inclusion of rural and peasant artists already as part of the socialist project in communism. And a lot of this continued after World War II. However, there was always a kind of a liberal divide as to why this should be included or not. So a lot of the naive artists were always included in these exhibitions of partisan art, of World War II art, and sometimes also in sort of like more, modernist exhibitions, but only some artists, few of them, not all of them. And there was a lot of kind of tension as to how this was explained, because people who wrote about this are extremely, like, this is so classist, so bad. I'm reading some of that, and it's sort of very imbued with Western view of naive art. So I'm reading some Yugoslav writers about this, and I am disgusted, quite honestly, with the way that they're reading it. It's really problematic. But not all people were like this. There were a lot of, there's a theater and literary writer, a critic, who writes about naive art in a very positive light, and like writes about it as a socialist project, as part of the socialist project. So there's a lot of very interesting tensions within that, and absolutely certain people in Yugoslavia saw this work absolutely as part of socialism. And I think that and no one has done a lot of work on this, and I'm planning to, looking at amateur societies, which goes back to some of what we said in intimism, amateur film societies, clubs, photography associations that were all done on amateur basis, are producing culture that's part and parcel of socialist commitment to culture. And elite institutions don't exhibit this, don't talk about it, are not, and still today art historiography is not interested. So I'm very interested in this, because this is also a product of socialism, and very much what you're talking about, and non-aligned modernism.
Thank you, Bojana, and thank you all. Let me check. Ovidiu, do you want to say something about these parallels in Romanian case of naive art that you mentioned in chat, because there is no comments from the audience?
Yeah, just a few words that it's amazing. Yeah, like myself also, I discovered this not ambivalence, but actually blatant contradiction between Romanian critics who both embraced this turn towards the popular expression, which was very strong in the 70s in Romania, and then exploded also in the 80s. And the critics who, looked at it indeed condescending. Actually, there's explicit colonial takes in which you have naive art discussed in the same chapter with African popular art, indigenous art, and this doesn't matter if it's like living or if we're talking about Maya art, right? So there's a flattening of categories and peoples, and that reflects this need for this aestheticization of the non-modern, right? And that's part of it. But the other, as you say, also in the Romanian case, is this enthusiasm once they also amongst artists themselves, actually, when they are put into situations with with common exhibitions or shows, festivals with naive painters or singers, and there's just an enthusiasm, and clearly it's like, okay, this is the potential that we were looking for, and it's basically a very effervescent cultural scene, and it's still it's one of the most effervescent cultural scenes, the internal cultural scenes that was produced by Romanian socialism, actually. So more to come on this, yeah.
No, this is very exciting topic. I'm also interested in this. I mean, there was, I find it, like once we reach this moment of conflict, that we are in the right spot, that we have to stay there and see, what's going on there. So, in the local scene, the discussions are also around, these encounters between, I don't know, the workers of the collectives in Yugoslav period, the socialist companies and artists that were coming to do, artwork with them or besides them, what was that? Was that imposition of kind of like a bourgeois idea of art, or was it, like a collaborative work, where were the borders? So this is something that I'm also interested in, and especially like the amateur art concept, because it was so pluralistic and it was really everywhere. It was like from the I don't know, from the factories to like it was already mentioned the cinema and so on. But it is interesting to look at the genealogy and compare it to the art that was done by the people in the countryside. And here just near where I live in Pančevo, where I am at the moment, there is a museum of naive art, and there are quite some like famous naive artists that worked here. So I'm very much looking forward to both of what you are doing, Bojana, and that you mentioned, Ovidiu. Let me see if there is anything in the chat. There was a small exchange between Laura and Bojana on the connection between Yugoslavia and Algeria. Do you want to say something about that, Bojana?
Not much. I'm just writing about, there was an exhibition, a traveling exhibition, a touring exhibition in 1975, which I thought it was only in Algeria, but actually it was sent to Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Iraq. And it started in Algeria and then kind of went to Morocco and then Senegal. And it was one of many. So this is like one that I found. And it was on it was on partisan art, and it was really interesting because when it arrived in Algeria, the Algerians asked that the title be changed to address more universally the idea of victory over fascism, because it was the 40th anniversary. 30th anniversary. My math is really bad. And so it was really interesting because of how, how it was accepted there, and how interested Algerians were for this art. And of course, there was naive art included in that. There were naive artists. And the Yugoslav side very clearly, talked about the NOB, the people's struggle in Yugoslavia, and equated and sort of made connections to Algerian War of Independence. And Algerians were very interested in that because of that links as well. So I'm writing about that. It's not done the text, but I can send it to Laura if she wants.
Thank you, Bojana. Čarna, do you maybe have anything to add or like any questions to raise?
I have so much that I will just, I won't talk about everything. This was really inspiring and productive. And thank you all for the questions and comments and so on. On socialist modernity, I mean, I take this term from Stephen Collier, who was writing about the Soviet Union and analyzing what he called the illiberal biopolitics in the Soviet Union, and analyzing how the biopolitical measures within the Soviet Union, within Russia, actually, in the Soviet Union, were organized in a very biopolitical way, but somehow differently from the biopolitics that we know of from, like, I don't know, France of the 19th century or Western European countries today, and so on. So I think there is something there that is, I find useful, this notion. I haven't found a lot that was written on it in relationship to Yugoslavia. I regularly cite your book, Bojana, although modernism and modernity are very, very different concepts. But somehow I think there is more research to be done on that link. But I actually have a question for Ovidiu, and this is not unrelated to that. I was wondering in what way does the citizenship or somehow the crossing of border affect this sense of intimate colonization? I'm thinking here about how we within when people, like white people, live within a Eastern European state, there is this unmarked racialization, and somehow this intimate colonization becomes somehow palpable, becomes somehow stronger, and felt once you cross the border and once you actually move. And I'm wondering about how citizenship and migration actually affect this. And yes, I'll end here.
Well, one thing that I could say immediately is that you can see all over the diasporic and migrant worker interviews and places that one thing that happens is even with migrant workers who tend to assimilate, right, rather than keep somehow the roots alive or whatever, you see this impetus, a creation of intimate spaces that are different, right? So for instance, in interviews with migrant workers from Spain that are collected by a Romanian sociologist who, from the first generations of migrants in the 90s and 2000s, one of the things that that was interesting was that they brought from home, lots of women brought from home these little figurines, right? And so they kept basically sort of like a Schönheitsecke, right, in the new place as a sort of resource of even if they lived, 10 in a room, then this small thing created, so kind of projected a sphere of intimacy that also gave them power, right? And this transpares also, there's a great theater piece by Nicoleta Isinencu and her group, the Teatru Spălătorie, that Manuela is gonna see soon in Freiburg, which documented the post of migrants, what is sent from Moldova to Italy and what is sent from Italy to Moldova, right? And you can see in that incredible emotional piece play the way, the point is not only to make money and sacrifice your life for the next generation and all that, but to keep or get some power from these little things that are asked from home. That makes no sense to ask for instance, for a comb. Yeah, but this was one of the elements that were asked the most by people who are living abroad from home, right? And so you can see that crossing the border, definitely, you have these enormous implications, these awakenings of, okay, I'm not only a Romanian or Moldovan, but I'm an East European. I'm thrown in these wider categories that I never knew existed, that are beyond my control. But then there's also resources of living with that and somehow through that. And I think that's where you find them somewhere. So.
If I may just put in one comment, because Manuela really got me in a video with Manuela, especially with your comments at the beginning of framing yourself of moving to Western Europe. And when I moved to North America, this is exactly my sort of travel, you're from like 18-year-old self, as how you kind of start realizing that you're other in some way, right? Like you're not the same as the Canadians or North Americans. And you're always an immigrant. You're not an expat. There's a difference in even English language where they always call themselves expats, and I will never be an expat. I'm always going to be an immigrant. And when I was in my teens, and when we were just, my parents and I were thrown in here in this godforsaken country of Canada, just joking. I remember very well, and this is for anthropologists and sociologists to work with, we couldn't find any jobs, right? Because you're an immigrant. So my dad and I used to work on farms in the summer. My dad is a specialist in internal medicine, and he didn't mind. He is on his job, but here the two of us, right? And and there's like a line of us, picking whatever it was, blueberries or whatever, and and there's like Turks and Mexicans, and all of us are there together, right? And so this is where you start finding that I had more connection with immigrants from Turkey, from Mexico, from Colombia than I did with Canadian people, right? And we all, like when I say we, as in sort of this group of immigrants, because I've encountered all of us saying the same thing, there's like the us and then there's the Canadians, right? So there's a really interesting ways in which you're kind of acculturated or not into this, and how you realize your otherness by living in this country, right? So, or outside. So those are like, I just wanted to acknowledge Manuela's intervention and Ovidiu's intervention, because I think they're important.
Thank you, Mary, very much, Bojana, and thank you all. I think it's now it's 6:15. I think this is a good point to end this conversation, which is only the start of this conversation. So I really hope that we will continue talking. And we have a fourth session in less than 45 minutes now. So the ones who wants to continue talking on this, please join us on our last session. Thank you very much, Bojana. Thank you, Manuela. Thank you, Čarna. Thank you, Ovidiu. This was very amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of your research and your experience with us. I'm overjoyed really to have you here and for this gathering. Thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ana, so much. And
thanks,
Kuda
Ana,
well.
and the Kuda team.
It was a real pleasure and honor to present with all three of you, and with Ana, of course.